So, Joe, Notturno, what did you think?
Well, it reminded me really strongly of two films in particular, and it was quite funny when I was putting the notes together. What I realized when I was looking up the two films it reminded me of. So the first film it really reminded me of stylistically was Fire at Sea. And when I was putting the notes together, I thought I must double check who that's by, and it's actually directed by Gianfranco Rossi. So it's the same filmmaker.
Right.
The other film it reminded me of was My Dan, that kind of miraculous documentary about the protests in Ukraine that eventually ousted Yanukovych. And that too was a film composed of almost, in fact, that one was entirely static shots that seemed remarkable and like they could only have been staged because it captured things that were spontaneous, but it just seemed so implausible. It wasn't staged. It was, I don't know how they did it. But it reminded me a lot of that film. And when I looked that up, that was directed by Sergei Lozhnitsa, who obviously made that State Funeral film that we reviewed a while ago.
Yeah.
So Notturno itself, it too is filmed mostly through, there is some camera movement, but it's mostly static shots. And it's characterized by a stylistic restraint that I'll come back to. It has astonishingly beautiful cinematography. Particularly the light in this film is really stark and so beautiful that it had the feel of a fictional film, a composed, stylized, intentional film. It's not, of course, it is a documentary, though there are elements of the boy's story, Ali, which included like subjective technical moments that were actually more in keeping with a fiction film. Like, for example, there is a moment where Ali was crouched under a tree and he looks up through the leaves, and then the camera does a POV shot and looks up through the leaves. And at another point, he's waiting by the side of the road to see if Hunter will pick him up and take him to work for the day. And then we cut and the truck is pulling into a lay-by to suggest that they've been on a journey. Now, the only way you could capture that shot accidentally, I mean, it's just implausible that it could have been done, that there just happened to be a camera at that point, or so it's either put together in a way, these sequences in a way that I just don't understand the logistics of it, or there are stylistic elements that, as I say, you would associate more with a fictional film. So there is this very subtle confusion between fiction and non-fiction that again becomes more interesting as the film progresses. One of the early really standout scenes is the woman in what I guess is a jail cell, and she's stroking the walls and talking to her son, who is obviously dead, communing with her son. And when I saw this scene, because there's no overt commentary from the filmmaker, and there's no real contextualizing of these sequences beyond the title card we get at the beginning, which is a very broad outline of what the film is concerning itself with, I start trying to read these sequences. Now, what am I being shown here and why? And I thought, well, is that what the film is doing? Is the film itself communing with the dead in some way, or attempting to? And then I start to impute a sense of like agency and a sense of sort of angry impotence to this sequence, because of course, communing with the dead is pointless. They're dead and they can't hear you. And then the film cuts and we see a picture, a photo of this woman's tortured son, his corpse. And I realized that actually the previous sequence is not symbolic of anything, that it's not a representation of the film's themes, that it is what it is. It's a scene of a woman grieving, and it's a portrait of profound trauma. And that's what this film is about, I think, most potently. It's a film about trauma. And I think a really interesting comparable text is that film we reviewed a couple of weeks ago, The Trouble with Being Born, right? And the reason I think it's an interesting comparison is because both films are characterized by a remarkable restraint, right? Like a stylistic restraint, holding back from the viewer, not sort of cueing our emotions through music or really sort of intrusive edits or anything like that. The difference between them was, now I enjoyed The Trouble with Being Born, but there is no doubt there was a kind of ethical ambiguity about its stylistic restraint, because it was employing that strategy to keep us feeling really uncomfortable and uneasy, and to, the way you put it, put us in a really unpleasant, difficult place. In contrast, this film's restraint felt entirely responsible. It felt like a really mature and respectful attitude to take, and the two films contrasted really sharply to me. Then going back to this idea of this subtle blurring of fact and fiction, although the filmmaker doesn't give us any overt political context, when we do get some really explicit politics, it's provided by these actors who are rehearsing their lines for a play they're going to perform, a really baldly political play, which is all about, you know, political intrigue and, you know, one system of power coming to just supplant the oppression of this, you know, the system it's uprooted. And so really overt politics. And they kind of pace corridors as they read and rehearse these lines, and they lay in bed and read their lines. And so the performative that is fictional sits inside the non-fiction. And as I was watching that sequence, I felt like here was the crux of the film. Perhaps here is what the film is about. Here's what it's saying, this fictional inside the non-fiction, but I couldn't quite work out what it was trying to say. And I wasn't sure what was going on there until I thought, well, maybe that is the point. Maybe the point is, how do we tell stories about this stuff? How do we talk about this stuff? And then there's what I think is the most pivotal scene, certainly the most impactful scene on me, that long sequence in which the children talk to their teacher and they describe the drawings they've made of the things they've seen. And it's a very quiet scene. The teacher quietly asks these sort of gently probing questions of the children. And the children answer quite frankly and describe the things they've seen. And the things they've seen are horrendous. You know, these truly appalling scenes of violence. And there is one boy who is talking through the drawings that they've pasted on the wall, and he's got a very, very visible and very pronounced stutter. And he describes, you know, these are the men who were cutting people's heads off, and this is where the women were chained to the walls. And it's just the most profoundly upsetting scene I can remember watching on film. Just devastating, I thought. The thing that I thought was that comes through this film most powerfully, particularly towards the end, was a sense of duration. And it's like the impact of that slowly soaked through the film and only really hit home right at the end, that there is a repetition of certain images that foregrounds time. For example, you have the boy and that hunter, they're out hunting the birds for such a long time that you see the transition from day to night. There are soldiers standing sentry beside this fluttering flag all night into day. There is the sequence of the woman putting the bedding away and then later on putting the bedding out again. So in this film, time passes. There is the passage of time. And you realize that the children in this film are going to get older. And that just like the filmmaker, time is objective. It doesn't pass comment on the film's events, that it just moves over people. But the objectivity of time didn't in this film feel cruel, and its non-judgmental character didn't feel amoral. Instead, somehow the film, I thought, felt profoundly human and profoundly humane, and at times attained a sense of grace almost that I think is truly remarkable. And so it's a very difficult film and a really powerfully upsetting film, but so it should be. And I think it's handled with extraordinary skill. And I thought it was really great.
Interesting. I had a different experience with it. You know, I'm really interested in types of documentary and documentary making myself. And so that issue of, you know, a documentary, the presence of a camera means that a documentary is never just impartial observation. There always is some engagement with the subjects. And so I thought, you know, I think this film is a really interesting kind of documentary in that way, because I think by the end of it, my feeling is that most of the scenes are actually quite staged. You know, that these are non-actors. I checked at the end, and it's just the names of all the people. There's no one playing any parts. So it appears like these are all non-actors. But I do think that every single scene is staged. The documentary maker has spoken with the subjects and agreed what they're going to do. So, you know, you gave that example of the tree. You know, the guy knew what shots were going to be made, and he, you know, did exactly what the director asked him to do. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but, you know, and in some ways, I think, you know, it's a more honest documentary to make it staged. I really like the idea of non-actors, but actually an element of, you know, this blurring of, as you mentioned, of fiction and non-fiction. Because obviously, as soon as he starts staging an element to it, it's, you know, it's not just reality. It becomes somewhat fictional. So I think this is a really interesting attempt at a kind of documentary format, which, you know, just isn't, it certainly wasn't cliched in any way. There were things I really loved about this documentary. I thought it was, you know, as you said, really, I thought it was so cinematic. I mean, it's just beautiful, isn't it? The light, the sky, the grays and the blues of the sky. You know, it's just extraordinary, and the kind of beautiful images of land and sky together, and color, and I mean, it's a lush film. And you know, the thing that really struck me about this film for a good proportion of it was how silent it is. You know, it's for many of those early scenes, the camera is just on a person who's maybe flicking through some papers or walking, you know, the women walking through that building before they arrive in the room, the woman looking at the photos of her son. We're really kind of hyper aware of quite small sounds because the film is so silent and kind of calm. And I began to realize, like when we see the guy in the boat going through the reeds, and it looks like there's a beautiful sunset at first, the sky's orange, and then we hear a couple of bangs in the distance, and we realize actually that that's not a sunset, that's, you know, a town burning, or and the bangs are guns. But there's a real calmness and beauty in him moving in the boat through these reeds, and the sound, and there's such poetry and beauty in the way this is made. So I really, really liked this. I thought that this was a documentary about war, which showed us moments of peace and calm close to the war, but we never actually saw war. And indeed, we never actually saw any fighting in this film, apart from where it was mediated either through the children or through the soldiers watching it on a tablet, or through the play with the psychiatric patients. So, you know, I think that as a general kind of way of making a documentary about war in the Middle East, I thought focusing on the silence and the calm in between the battles, if you like, and in between the trauma was actually really a very clever and interesting documentary. I really loved it. The scene that you really liked, the children, I actually find really problematic, because everything I liked about the film was that it was so subtle. It was about war. You know, we never knew which country this was in. We did see a border at one point, and sometimes you do see a bit of a flag, but you know, there's, I love the fact that there was almost a neutrality to this film, and it was about war through the times when there isn't war and there is actually still peace and even poetry. You know, I really like this idea of poetry being in places where there's trauma. You know, where is it possible to have poetry alongside trauma? I think that's a really interesting subject. So when we get the children talking about what, you know, these terrible things, I just found that too literal, almost crude, compared to the subtlety of this, you know, beautiful poetic kind of study of the moments in between the fighting almost. I felt like it was ruining the film that I wanted it to be. And by that point, I realized it was completely staged. You know, it's not, I felt like the kids were totally aware of the camera being there, and, you know, it didn't feel very natural. You know, they'd almost been coached into, I mean, I'm not saying they weren't telling the truth, and it was horrific what they were saying. You know, I get that, but it did feel like they were coached to perform for that moment. And powerful as that is, to have the children talking about the experience, that for me just seemed almost like it didn't fit with the film that I was watching and the way that I was reading the film. The play within the play, the psychiatric patients, I found that worked more for me. I thought there was more ambiguity in that. There was more of a vagueness. I mean, I think, you know, I had a problem that ISIS was actually mentioned in this film, because then that did give it some specificity. I thought that it was better that the film, it was better the more neutral it was, and the more it was universal it was and could have almost been anywhere, the more powerful it was. I thought when it actually became more explicit, it lost something of that, you know, beauty and poetry. And I just don't really feel like they fitted together. I could never reconcile the experience he was giving me through all those cinematic, beautiful images with this what became quite literal presentation of the impact of war on these people's lives. I mean, I don't want to be too harsh on it, because I think it's a really ambitious piece of work, and clearly you know, all the people in it are non-actors, and he must have, you know, spent a long time in some possibly dangerous situations, and to get permission to film, he must have had to have permission to film, like in the psychiatric hospital, or, you know, with the soldiers. It's extraordinary, really, the trust that he was able to build up with the people in the film that allowed him to kind of manipulate these situations, to kind of stage these scenes. So I really admire it as a documentary, but it just, I couldn't reconcile the kind of the two different things that he'd done in the documentary. I did think it was too long. Yeah, I felt it was a long time. I think everything that we saw in this film could have been done in 18 minutes, and I think it would have been a tighter work. But I think it's definitely worth watching. I mean, some really striking things. I thought the opening scene was extraordinary, or one of the first scenes. I think it is the opening with the soldiers and you know, the kind of rhythmic element of that, that each time they come into the camera, they shout, "Hey!" and you know, and then they're marching, and then they disappear, and then another lot appears, and then you're waiting for the next lot to appear. I mean, I found that, you know, a breathtaking start, you know, but again, it was about sound. It was about, you know, that actually wasn't really about peace and calm, but it was, you know, it was an experience. And yeah, very impressed by this as a piece of work, but it just didn't quite work for me.
I mean, it would be interesting to learn a bit more about how the film was made.
Yes.
I strongly disagree. I'd be very, very surprised if anyone was primed in the way you suggest, particularly the children. It's my feeling that that camera sat there, and that those children were not told what to say or what was expected of them. Certainly the woman in the cell lamenting her dead son, that's not been staged at all. I think that's a really interesting point, and I agree with you about, you know, it's fascinating to tell a story of warfare through peace and calmness. I would say, however, that you know, you said that you mentioned ISIS and got a bit specific at times. And I suppose I'd argue that grief is not universal. You know, these are specific stories about specific people, and I think it's right that they felt human, and that some things. I mean, I agree with you. There is a way to do things in a way that is arresting and poetic and stuff, but some things are not ambiguous. You know, and I think actually there's something dishonest, or there could potentially be something dishonest about taking something like a 10-year-old child's experience of warfare and trying to treat it with a kind of subtle poeticism. I think it's more responsible and more mature and more straightforward to have a camera sit there in the corner while that child tells you what they've seen. I found that powerful, you know, really, really powerful. And it just seemed a bit, I don't know, like, why is your story of horror not more poetic and subtle? You know, it seemed like, well, because this is my story of horror, you know. Sometimes it's appropriate that things are on the nose. Not everything should be oblique and kind of subtle. I think some things should be straightforwardly presented as they are. But yeah, I mean, it would be really interesting to see where the line is. I mean, I'm not sure if I want to know or not. I think on balance, I probably do want to know where the line is in terms of people being coached and stuff, because you're undoubtedly right. There is an element of that. But I think I certainly felt, perhaps I just wanted to be generous to the film, but I certainly felt that there was far less of that than you did.
Right. There is a Q&A after the film, isn't there? So
there is, yeah.
I didn't watch it because we agreed to not find out more about the film and just respond to it. But I would definitely like to watch it to learn more about
how it was done,
how it was actually made.
I think
didn't you feel that there was a conflict? Didn't you feel any kind of conflict then between how subtle the cinematic elements of the film were, and then how raw the scene with the children is? Did you feel that they sat together? Because I think maybe, you know, listening to you speak, maybe I'm being a bit harsh on that scene, and especially, you know, implying that they may have been coached, but it felt like that after the incredible subtlety of the rest of the film.
I didn't know. And if you,
No.
I mean, if you really look at it in a sort of fine-grained way, the subtlety is stylistic flourishes. Do you know what I mean? It's the light, it's the way the thing has been sequenced together. So I don't think there's anything jarring about, you know, sometimes people in a film with little dialogue have to actually say things. And the things these people say are the things they've experienced. They can't help it that their experiences are just, you know, astonishingly brutal. It's almost that, you know, some things are not subservient to the tone or the atmosphere, or, you know, sometimes there is no subtlety. You know, there's just the thing itself. And I didn't find it jarring, actually. No, because, you know, things can be both. Things can be both very explicit and straightforward and, you know, quite subtle and oblique. And actually, I think, you know, stylistically, the whole film is of a piece. Even there, you know, it's still a restrained, static camera. Everyone speaks very quietly. You know, there's nothing effusive or extravagant about it. It's just what they're saying. And that is shocking, but then, of course, it's shocking.
Yes. And there is a subtlety in mediating those horrible experiences through children rather than adults, and through the pictures. And
I mean, it
yeah,
could be just footage of people being dragged through the streets in cages, and, you know, the orange boiler suits and those horrible, you know, it could have been that. It wasn't. So there is still an element of, like, you know, a stylistic restraint there, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely worth watching, I would say. Definitely a unique piece of work.
Yeah, for sure. Very interesting filmmaker as well. And the last thing, I seem to remember that Fire at Sea, some people criticized that film for similar reasons. Some people found that staged, or at least it felt like it was staged. I'm almost sure that wasn't either. But the fact that it feels like it is perhaps sort of undermines the film's intentions. You know, if you're left with that impression, even if it's not the case, then, you know, perhaps there's a problem there. I don't know. But
yeah, I must admit, I have a general feeling, and maybe I'm being harsh on this film, but I like a documentary maker that's honest enough to stage a bit of the documentary. You know, I like that. But when you look at the what was that film? Stop the Pounding Heart, that we watched a while ago. Although we didn't review that, did we, on here? We haven't reviewed that on here, but you and I discussed that film. That film was with non-actors, and the camera was definitely present, and I think that probably some of those conversations between the characters were staged, but it felt much more natural than this. To me, this didn't feel natural. And I'm ready to give a documentary maker a lot of scope for you know, for intervening in the scene. I think it's dishonest to pretend that it's totally neutral. You know, the presence of the camera has to be, you know, if you acknowledge that, I think that's a good thing. And, you know, I admire this guy's, I mean, obviously there's a lot of footage. He spent a lot of time in dangerous places, in difficult situations, negotiating, building up the trust of people. I really admire this as a piece of work. Even if I still think it doesn't quite work, I think it's a pretty impressive piece of work as a whole.
Yeah,
So
agreed.
what are we doing next?
Next is Cow, the new Andrea Arnold picture.
Excellent. Looking forward to that.